Welcome to the Project Endure podcast, the place where we talk about life, endurance, persistence, perspective, and so much more. I'm Joe Rinaldi, and I'll be your host. Let's jump in. Before we get started, let me share a quote with you. The great Les Brown once said, "You can't see the picture when you're in the frame." If you felt stuck in your fitness, mindset, or life as a whole, head down to the link in the show notes and reach out to learn more about Project Endure Coaching so that we can help you step outside of the frame and bridge the gap between who you are now and who you want to be. We can't wait to hear from you. Now, let's get to the episode. Welcome back to the Project Endure podcast, episode 34. We have myself, Joe Rinaldi, and we have a very, very special guest out in Utah, Sinan Ozyemisci. Sinan, how you doing, man?
Good, man. Really good. I'm just impressed over here by that last name pronunciation, so I appreciate it.
I've been sitting in my apartment all day just repeating Ozyemisci, Ozyemisci, Ozyemisci. So, you know,
I'm glad neighbors with that.
I'm glad I nailed it, man. Well, why don't you do this? I know you. We know each other through the Pursuit podcast and just our conversations outside of that podcast. But why don't you introduce yourself to the audience? And you can keep it pretty high level because we'll dive in as we go along here.
Absolutely, man. I'll give a quick rundown on myself. I am a registered dietitian. As profession, I am somebody who loves school, who loves education. Joe knows this. You know, if I could constantly pay for school and never stop going to school, that would be one thing that I would do. But I did my undergrad in sports nutrition and then went on to do 2 masters in dietetics and applied clinical nutrition before becoming a dietitian. I am currently with Stronger You Nutrition, and I am managing coaches on staff at the moment. Just a little personal, story about me. I actually came into it as a interior designer, interior architecture major. That's where I applied to all my colleges for. That was my goal. My grandpa is a big architect in Turkey. My dad is a civil engineer and architect. So I figured I'd follow in the footsteps. And then right when I got to college, I decided to change my major. And I love the fact that I changed my major because I am obsessed with what I do now. But just to sprinkle in there, we'll talk about it a little bit during the podcast as well, I'm sure. But, Turkey is where my entire family is, extended families in Belgium. And I spend as much of the year as possible that I can, probably 3 to 4 months out of the year overseas in Turkey because of the variation in lifestyle out there, the culture, the ethnicity, and just the cuisine out there. So I love it, man. That's me.
Let me ask you a question. I'm not sure anybody's asked you this on a podcast before, but Sinan, does that mean something special or specific?
Yeah, I feel like you did your research here because that ties right into it. So Sinan is a famous architect in Turkey. Architect Sinan, he built a lot of the current, history in Istanbul. And my grandpa was a big architect in Istanbul as well. So I think, it trickled down to the fact that, if he's going to become an architect, we got to name him after an architect. So that's what I got named after.
Gotcha. So interior design. Now, the people listening to this podcast will know this before the podcast comes out because we're on a couple week delay here. But my wife and I are under contract on our first home. So actually a couple days thank you, man. A couple days from when we record this episode, we'll be closing. And last weekend we went to the local hardware store and we're trying to pick out paint colors. And I thought we would just walk in there and be like white, gray, black, blue, like we're good. And I had no clue how many different colors existed.
100%. It's one of the biggest things. I always say, if you're overwhelmed by the idea of nutrition, go to Home Depot and look at the different shades of white you can pick for a wall. And overwhelm was an understatement at that point. So I totally agree. And that's one of the reasons why I changed my major. I like detail, but I'm not somebody who gets very meticulous and caught up on detail. And when I went to look at colleges, it was during their finals week and just seeing these kids, sleeping at the studio, sleeping in, where they were doing a lot of their projects and, kids running on maybe 2 hours of sleep for 6 days of, project work. It made me realize that the level of detail they put into it, I would just be a mediocre architect. And that's what set me apart. So Yeah, those kids go through every single shade of paint you could think of when they do those designs, man.
It's so interesting because I would imagine for a lot of people out there who don't know a lot about nutrition,
Mhm.
they probably think something similar about nutrition as to how precise it must have to be and how dialed in and meticulous you might have to be to get the results you want. Real quick, because this is going to take us off topic from the meat of the podcast, but in your view, does nutrition have to be meticulous?
It doesn't. It
Yeah.
really doesn't. And I think, with where culture is headed right now, and with where the saturation and the messiness of our headspace right now, I think the more meticulous you can get with nutrition, the tougher spot you'll put yourself in. So as long as you step back, as long as you pull it back to the basics of it, I think you'll do a far better job with personal nutrition than to get into the weeds of it. So
Yeah, I love that. Well, with that being said, why don't we jump in? I'm going to ask you the first question, which is, what is the hardest thing or circumstance that you've ever had to handle in life? So something that you didn't have a choice in.
for sure. Yeah. And I think, shifting a little bit into more of the situations that I've gone through. And, one of the biggest things that I dealt with coming out of high school and going into college was a big group of our friends coming out of high school. We actually ended up losing a lot of our friends to, addiction or suicide. So there was a lot of stop and think in terms of the perspective of life, in terms of, thinking and rethinking the path of happiness and what it really meant, because we were surrounded by all these folks that you would never, realize that there was anything wrong. So I think one of the biggest light bulb moments, I want to say, and that's not really the best way to put it, but one of the biggest things that ever happened to, any of us is it really made us realize that there's multiple different paths we can go down. And I think that played a big part in my decision with college and with my major and with just the way I engage with everybody around me as well. And it's lasted a long time in terms of how I think about every single thing I do in life now.
So take me back maybe to when you started losing some of those friends and maybe what your gut initial reaction was at that time and how that thought process and perspective has shifted as time has gone on.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it started back in probably about sophomore or junior year of high school. And, I grew up in New Jersey, in a wealthier part of New Jersey. It was just a lot of, if there was no social interaction or activity, there was just a high chance of, becoming addicted to something, or it was a tough place for kids to grow up, I think, in that perspective, because we never think of it from that approach. So sophomore, junior year is when some of our friends really started getting into it. And I think that the biggest shift in perspective was, as much as I say this, it definitely makes you age in your perspective a lot quicker when you see friends around you get involved with certain things. You put on this, I guess, gas pedal in terms of becoming very mature in the decisions that you make, becoming very like, hey, probably not the best idea if we want to think about what's down the road, what's in the future, and just really thinking of it from that scope. And that's really something I would have never thought of as a junior or senior in high school if I hadn't, had those conversations with some of these friends that ended up passing away. And I think that's one of the biggest, headset shifts that we see with anybody that's dealing with, addiction or, suicide or just even depression. It's just when we're surrounded by those folks and we have those conversations, it makes you pull yourself out of the weeds and just really think about the bigger picture.
Yeah, there's this I'm actually not sure who this person is, but Kahil Gibran once said, "To live on in the hearts of others is not to die." And it's really interesting to hear you sit here and talk about the people that you've lost and how they continue to impact you today,
Absolutely.
even though they're no longer here. Is there anything you would say to those people if you could go back and say something to them?
I think, just like you said, the impact that they've had on all of us, even to this day, I think they would have had a much bigger impact if they were here too. So I know it's a very tough situation for them, as it's most of the time uncontrollable, but it's the impact that they've had on us. I don't know. It's a weird feeling in terms of like you're thankful for the impact that they've had on you, but if they were here, the impact would be tenfold. So I think, just it'd be amazing to have them here, but it's a learning experience in life that, I think everybody ends up navigating through.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I'll often try to think about is, is there a silver lining in a situation,
For
or,
sure.
did something good come out of this bad thing? And when
Absolutely.
you look back at this circumstance, do you feel like that's the case at all? Can you find any good out of the
Uh,
bad?
Absolutely, I think so. And with even talking to their brothers, their sisters, their parents, very frequently since sophomore, junior year of high school, we're still in communication all the time. I think it has brought out a lot of good in terms of how can we help those around us? How could we take some great takeaways from those in terms of making sure the rest of our group has stayed in touch, stayed in communication, stayed clean, and everybody has kept each other on their toes in positive adventures and silver lining adventures instead of channeling in any bad behavior. So I definitely think there is silver lining to everything, and I think in this case the initial shock is it's shaky for sure, and it's something that a lot of folks would never want to deal with, but I think the silver lining is far bigger than any of us we tend to look at sometimes. So
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, to be able to pull a silver lining out of something
yeah.
as sad as what you've experienced, and the families of your friends who are no longer with us, is, it takes a special kind of person. And do you feel like you've been that kind of person who's been able to find the good in things your whole life, or is that shifted?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And again, I don't want to give myself too much credit, but I think it has shifted a little bit for sure. But I think I've always been somebody who's always looked for a light in those situations, regardless, even before any of that. And I think it's just the exposure that I've had in terms of, moving from a completely different country to the US, not speaking English when I moved here, and just a lot of things that I could have knocked my head against the wall on and would have been like, hey, this sucks, I'm never going to learn the language. But instead, like throwing on Friends and watching Friends with subtitles so I can learn English faster, and just like certain things like that. I think there's always light and positivity in a lot of these things where, we see the same with nutrition, we see the same with fitness, we see the same all across the board in terms of you could either keep digging yourself a rut and just be like, yeah, this sucks, I'm never going to get out of this. Or you can always say, hey, maybe there's a step ladder somewhere that we can just climb right out and, see the light. So I think there's a very positive approach to all of it, like you said, for sure.
Dude, that's such a cool perspective and anecdote. Who would have ever thought that Friends is the reason why
I know.
you know the English language?
Right? Yeah, I was supposed to be in ESL for like 3 years, and I ended up getting out in a year and a half because I think I watched every episode.
What was that like coming to America, and how old were you when that happened?
Yeah, I was 9, about to turn 10. So coming here, it was a fun story to just bring light in. I took an English course about 6 months before I moved here. I was like, okay, family knows we're moving. Let's do this. Let's get situated. Took an English course. Didn't realize it was British English. I thought I was coming into it. So I took this course in Turkey. Nailed it. I was like, okay, we're good. Let's go. Let's do this. At least I'll know what I'm talking about. One of my best buddies, he'll probably listen to this podcast too, Nick, he was my first friend when I moved here. I came in and I was like, hey, I'm going to be friendly, and I'm going to tell this kid he's got cool pants on. So I was like, hey, mate, nice trousers. And he looked at me, dude, and he started laughing so loud in the middle of class. I'm like, wow, I just ruined it. What did I do? And he's like, can you talk me through some of the stuff you've learned? And I talked him through, and he's like, I think we have to start over from scratch with the language, dude. He's like, you're probably going to stick out even more if you keep going with the British language. Let's start from scratch. So I think that was another additional flame under my butt to keep going with, okay, we got to learn the language. We got to clean it up. So again, it goes back to the same thing that you said. Do I see the light and do I see the positivity in all these situations? I think that was one of the biggest helpers for me when I moved here, because, anybody else could have easily in that situation been like, oh man, this sucks. I'm not, I don't care about this language. I hate this place. I want to go back. But it was total opposite for me.
I think there's something cool in that story too, as like, you're in America. It's probably going to almost be impossible for you to continue to live and grow and thrive here if you don't learn the English language. And so there's a level of necessity where your back's against the wall and you have to do this thing. Do you feel like that level of pressure has been beneficial in other areas of your life as well?
I think so. I think it has definitely kept me on track with a lot of stuff. I do reflect back to, even though it was like 2001, 2002, I do reflect back to how quickly I picked up a language. And I have this comparison in my head, like, hey, it's a 6-month project you're working on. You learned a language in a year and a half. If you can't finish the 6-month project without, complaining and moaning, you are, clearly in the wrong headspace for it. So it does, it flares up on me a lot in terms of like, thinking about that. And I'm like, if I picked up a language, didn't pick up an accent, and I'm in this, this place I need to be with that, I can definitely overcome anything. So.
Yeah. Well, cool. So why don't we do this? Because obviously you've had some circumstances in life that have been hard that you didn't necessarily choose for yourself. But I also know just from where you are that you've also had to choose some hard things and do those things on purpose. So what is the hardest thing that you've ever done on purpose? And also, why have you done that thing?
Yeah. That's a really good question, man. I think, I would say one of the hardest things that I've done on purpose, and why, and I think this will resonate a lot with, folks working from home, remote now, post-COVID, was to leave a full-time gig at a Big Ten university and take a remote online job for a company that was online. So that was one of the biggest things for me. I was at Penn State. I was working a job that I was, I loved it. It was just a very stable job. It was one of those things that, if you're working at the university and you were thinking about retirement, you were thinking about, finishing up work, there's no conversation that was like pre-60 years old. Everybody's like, hey, you're here, you're locked in. We'll see you when you're 60 so we can talk about your 401k. I was like, okay, this is, it was such a safe space. And I think the hardest decision that I made was almost fueled by the fact that it was such a safe space too. I was like, I don't like playing it safe. The most dangerous thing you can do in life is play it safe. So I was like, let's figure out what needs to be done. And that's when I took a remote position. I think that was one of the hardest things that I did on purpose. And a lot of folks will think, it's hard. Yes, it's hard because, you don't have a brick and mortar location. The job security is not as, in some cases, not as secure as it would be with, a brick and mortar university that's well known. But there's so much more impact beyond it too, like personal life, I think about grandfathers and great grandfathers, like if you think about your grandparents and you tell them like, hey, I quit my job at a university to take a remote coaching position, like every single reaction was like, you are out of your mind. You might as well just sit down and play video games for the rest of your life. It's one of those conversations. So it definitely impacted that initial talk. It impacts a lot, it pulls you out of routine for a little bit until you get into it, whether it's fitness, whether it's nutrition, whatever it is. And even with dating, like one of the biggest conversations that I have with a lot of, again, remote employees is, how do you stay put long enough that you can get into a relationship and invest in a relationship? Because there's no brick and mortar that you can be like, hey, this is where I work, this is where I'll be, let's figure something out around it. It's, me, I'm on the road maybe 8 months out of the year. So it's, yeah.
Well, first and foremost, I can relate. When I left my job, my friends, super supportive, my parents, super supportive, my grandparents didn't quite understand, wanted to be supportive, but my grandpa still to this day, I'll call him up and I'll say, hey, how's retirement? And, it's different, right? But there's a quote by John Shedd that comes to mind. He said, a ship is safe in harbor, but that's not what ships are for. Yeah. And I think for a long time, I thought about risk. When I thought about risk, I thought about the downside. I thought about, if I do this thing, what are the negative consequences potentially? And now when I think of risk, I think the biggest risk is not taking the risk that you feel like you're meant to take, right?
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about when you left your job and people don't necessarily understand. So some people in your life maybe don't get it. How do you navigate through those feelings and emotions? And did you ever doubt that was the right decision for you once you made it?
Absolutely. I think everybody will have that one moment of doubt, especially when it's a family member or a parent or a close friend that, you have that first couple of weeks where work feels slow or work just feels different. And everyone's like, dude, are you sure you made the right decision? And you have this thought of like, oh, is it too late to go back to my old position? I wonder if they'll ever take me back. So I definitely had that initial thought of doubt. And I think that a lot of the remote positions that we see now, they are either startups or they're just starting to build out these remote positions, just because of, with the pandemic, with a lot of brick and mortar locations closing down. And I think that's one of the biggest doubt creators in there, because they're brand new positions. They are just being built out specifically for a remote employee. And I think that's what scares people, not the individual that takes that position, but everybody around, because they're like, yeah, but what does the other, coach liaison make? And we're like, oh, well, there's no coach liaison position ever created before this. And then they have that like, oh boy, what's going to get into the next steps. And I think that's one of the hardest parts about it, for sure.
So in the beginning there, when things are maybe a little bit slow, you're in that gray space of transition, and you have that doubt that maybe creeps in a little bit. What kept you from picking up the phone or sending that email to Penn State and saying like, hey, I know I just left, but can you take me back?
I'll be honest, I was able to overlap them perfectly, where I started the new role as I was still riding out Penn State before I even put in my 2 weeks. And it was kind of a feeler, but not necessarily a, on purpose feeler. It just, the timing worked out so well. So I got a really good feel for, hey, this is what I want to do, and this is exactly where I want to be. But I think if you pull all of that, the lucky overlap out of it, the biggest thing was, again, it goes back to the same conversation we have with question one. It makes you rethink the path of happiness and, where you want to take life. And my biggest goal was to, travel, spend more time with family across the ocean, and just really be flexible in what I do. And I think that was the final stamp on it for me. It was like, hey, you have the flexibility. This is what you want to do. This is your passion. And if it helps you check off one or two goals that are on your, big life bucket list, then you've done an amazing job.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting way to look at things. And it definitely resonates with me. And I'm curious, I wish I could just ask the people listening right now if it resonates with them, but I think it would. And I don't think though many people act on that, or I don't think many people act on that in a timely manner. And maybe they look back and have some kind of regret down the road. Do you feel like future regret is something that drives your action in the here and now? I know that's a weird way to phrase that. I guess another way to think of it is, do you ever look into the future and think, man, if I don't do this thing now, I'm going to regret it, and I don't want to feel that way, so I might as well do it?
Yeah, 100%. I definitely do. It's one of those things that, if you overlook the possibility or a chance, it's something you'll kick yourself in the head, 2 times as much for. And that's one of the things everybody thinks of, at least my friends that I've talked to, everybody thinks of taking a big leap like this, a remote position jump from a brick and mortar location, as essentially putting money in stocks and, think of it as an investment. But the thing is, it's not as risky as a lot of people put it to be. There's still backing to it. There's no gamble in terms of, back and forth. Yes, there's a little bit of fun of gambling. But I think it's one of those things that if you don't do it, and then you see something really, like pre-COVID, if you think about a remote position, and you were like, yeah, it's kind of weird that it's remote and they don't have to go into an office. We never expected, 2.5, 3 years of that pandemic to happen. But then you look at it now and you're like, oh man, I wonder if I can find a job that doesn't make me go back to the office anymore. Because, people think about hybrid positions and fully remote positions. So if you don't take that initial step and then you look back 2 or 3 years later down the road, that's essentially 2 or 3 years you've kind of just sat stale for. So
yeah, I couldn't agree more. And also, if you think about all the big breakthroughs and innovations from a technology standpoint, right? The people who were on the cusp of that innovation, who were doing those things before it was cool, right? Bill Gates, for example, had access to computers in high school, which was super rare for the time. He was doing all that nerd stuff while all the other people are like, oh, I wonder what Bill's up to. He's probably typing on a computer. And now they look at Bill Gates and they're like, oh man, he was onto something. Like, it was different back then, but he was onto it, right? Yeah. So I want to rewind real quick, because you said you had some overlap between your job transition, and I also had some overlap between my job transition. I was building up my online coaching business to a point where I felt comfortable enough to take that quote unquote leap of faith. And I think a lot of people look at people who change jobs, change career paths, and they think, oh man, they must have just built up the courage and jumped. No preparation involved. Meanwhile, it was very calculated on my end. It sounds like it was very calculated on your end. What are some of the difficulties about maybe building up and preparing while you're at a job that you know you're going to leave? And why did you do it that way?
Yeah, it was definitely calculated. That's for sure. I can't go into something like that without a calculation. The biggest, I think, difficulty and, positive takeaway, I think they are the same thing. It's when you start doing something that, you want to transition to, when you check off that bucket in terms of that second job that you just took that you want to transition into, it makes you realize how much you might dislike or not enjoy the previous job. So I think the hardest part is spending the 2, 3, 4 weeks, whatever that transition period is, still being your 100% at that other job. And I think a lot of people don't realize that until they, start going side by side on some of these things, and they lose so much interest in the first job that it kind of just puts them in a weird place. And and in my head, at least, I never want to be the person that is a part of something and only commits 50, 60%. I'm always somebody that's, if I'm there, I'm putting in 100%, maybe 110%, regardless of if I know I'm going to leave in the next 2 weeks or not. So I think that overlap and that actualization or that realization for a lot of people that, that take the new leap or a job, they have the toughest part. So.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because it is easy when you lose interest in something to stop giving your best effort to that thing. But what you said is really key, is just, if you're there, you're going to show up with everything that you have and maybe then some, up until that last day. And then it's transition time. Now, I think one of the things that piqued my interest is when you were at Penn State, you were saying most people think about retirement a way off in the future. And I was having a conversation with a client of mine, and we were talking about the concept of comfort. And we were talking about how a lot of people think, oh, I'm going to work really, really hard now, and then someday I'm going to retire and sit on a beach and have this big season of comfort, right? I'll be able to do whatever I want, all this freedom. But I don't think that's actually the comfort that most of us actually want. And I think, based off of this conversation I had with this client, that a lot of the comfort that you and I probably get from life is in the small things, is in the process, in the pursuit of something greater. So I would love your take on that, and like what you see the role of comfort as in your life.
Yeah. I think, and just going back to that retirement concept, that, I'm a big fan of listening to a lot of, financial independence podcasts. And if you listen to those guys, as soon as they retire, they start a timer of 3 to 6 months before they extremely bored and they have to do something else, whether they start a podcast, whether they pick up a new hobby, whether some of them start blogs and, essentially end up doing the career that they initially should have been doing because they're so passionate and into it. So I think that is the key, that is the actual term of retirement and comfort in retirement. So when I think about comfort, when I think about, what feels right, I think it's being able to do what you enjoy. And I know it sounds so cliche to say, but, just not feeling like you're doing work, like anybody else who would look at your schedule, who would look at your day-to-day calendar, be like, dude, you're out of your mind. How do you function? But to you, when you look at that calendar, you're like, let's have this first cup of coffee and then let's go right into tackling such an amazing day ahead. So it's the perspective. The outside perspective never matches the inside perspective sometimes, but the comfort really comes in when you start enjoying what you're doing.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I also want to ask you a follow-up question. Do you have days at work, no matter how much you enjoy what you do, days at work that just feel like work?
Yeah, hell yeah. I think everybody does. I think you would be unhuman or you would be complete BS if that was the case. As long as everything in moderation, as long as you enjoy 80% of what you do, and there's 20% of, okay, this is a lot. This is, where I just sit in the corner and huff and puff for a hot minute. It's just, it happens. And that's the thrill of it. So.
Yeah, I think that's important to highlight too, because I think a lot of people see through social media, oh, Sinan is doing every day he wakes up, he does what he loves. Like Joe, every day it's busy, but he loves every second of it. And for the most part, that's true. I enjoy almost everything that I get to do almost all the time. But some days it kind of just, it's hard work, right?
Yeah.
And it's always hard work, but sometimes it's sucks sometimes. But
Yeah,
that's part
we
of
were
it.
just talking about that before we started. You and I were chatting about how I'll be spending 3.5 months or 4 months in Turkey, and when I post from Turkey, just because of the time change, everybody's like, "Oh, look at this kid living on a yacht, doing this, doing that." And what a lot of people don't realize is it'll still be a Eastern time workday for me, and that's 7 hours ahead. So I'll be working 1 p.m. to midnight. So it's like, a lot of I think social media is what it is. You look at social media and you're like, okay, everything looks super easy. Does this kid even work? What's the deal? But the grind that goes in, behind the scenes essentially is what really allows you to have that comfort place. Otherwise, I would feel less comfortable if I had no tough days, because I'd be like, I'm either doing something wrong or someone's about to just come and knock on my door and tell me I'm the worst employee here. It's like you have to be on your toes at all times, it's fun.
Yeah, it is fun. And I think to go kind of a Sam Tooley route here, who you never got to meet on the Pursuit podcast because he wasn't there. You will. He likes to say, one of the best feelings in the world is to put your head on the pillow at night and just know that you gave it everything that you had. And I think that is one of the most comfortable feelings, no matter how exhausted you are, no matter how hard of a day it was. If you showed up and you gave your best, like what more could you ask for,
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Well, with that being said, Sinan, I know you're a very humble guy and you're also a very in shape human being. What is the hardest thing that you've ever done physically? Tell us about that.
Oh man. Oh,
I know a lot to go through here mentally.
hardest thing I've done physically?
Yeah.
Or like workout wise?
Yeah, like a race, a competition, a pursuit.
Okay. I'll actually call somebody out on this. My college buddy, Adam Klink. He was, I think, the most.
By the way, episode 10 of the podcast, if you're listening and you want to listen to Adam's episode.
Yes, he's amazing. But he was definitely the most humbling experience of a workout I've ever had in my life. We were in college together. We used to work out together at Rutgers. And every workout that I did with him, it ended up being just like a Globo Gym workout. We would just go in, I think I would catch him right at the end of his CrossFit workout. So it would just be more isolation and, just more vanity work essentially. So one day I was like, hey, Adam, I know you're preparing for regionals. This is 2014. And I was like, I'm going to jump in on one of these CrossFit workouts with you. And at the time I was just very, bodybuilder focused. I thought I was in shape until we did like a 9-round workout and Adam beat me by 5 rounds. And I was like, dude, I'm not even halfway through the workout. What the hell just happened? So that was a very humbling experience in terms of, you realize where you can set the marker or drop the pin for where you think you're fit. And then you compare yourself to somebody else that's a very high caliber athlete in that field. And it makes you rethink, it makes you realize what the hell is going on. When I did triathlons, I was like, okay, I think I'm doing a great job. And then you see somebody that holds like a 5:10 pace for a half Ironman. And I'm like, sure, I'll never be able to do that. So it's, I think the most humbling experience or the toughest physical challenge that I've ever had was working out alongside somebody who was the 1% of athletes for that specific category of, exercise. So.
I think comparison gets a bad rep. I think oftentimes when people talk about comparison, it's, comparison is the thief of joy. You shouldn't do it. Just stay in your lane. But at the same time, when you're intentional with surrounding yourself with people who are better than you are in a given area, and you have that as a benchmark, not as a benchmark to say, oh man, I wish I could be there. I feel so bad about myself, but a benchmark of like, hey, what's this guy doing? Because I want to be there. Let me learn from him. Let me be around that person. I think that's super powerful.
Yeah, I think the learning experience is the bigger piece of it. And you have to be open-minded to, learn it. Especially a lot of guys, we'll go into it with a competitive mindset of saying, all right, if I lost by 5 rounds now, next time I'm not going to let him beat me by more than 3 rounds, or I'm going to beat him on a nice workout. You get this unrealistic approach of, completely discounting how much work he's put in for years and years and years leading up to it, especially with, some of these endurance athletes too. I'm like, dude, nobody gets up and they're like, oh, my legs feel good today. Maybe I'll, break 2 hours in a marathon. It's one of those things that it takes decades of, of practice, of headspace, of just discipline to get there. Yeah. And I think the comparison is not necessarily to how that individual functioned in that one specific workout, but we just need to get around the ego, get around the testosterone, and figure out that the comparison should be more so about the discipline and the hard work that they put in to get there. And that's the fun about it. It's the process about it, like you said.
That is so good, man. Because I do think most times, especially again with social media, people are comparing outcomes, results, superficial, a snapshot into somebody's life, and we don't get to see the process. But really, if we're going to compare anything, we should be taking notes on what got somebody to the place that we might want to be someday. That's powerful.
Yeah, for sure.
So with that being said, I want to ask you another question, and this one's pretty simple, but what does the word endurance mean to you?
So when I think of endurance, I actually pull it out of context in terms of endurance athletes. Initially I would say endurance always brings up, some of the longer, races that I've done. But I think endurance now, in the perspective that I'm in, just with work, just with my personal life, I think endurance is a more so comparison of that into my day-to-day life, in terms of a profession, in terms of a career, in terms of a life. I think about, again, this is going to be pitching it from a running perspective, but how hard of a pace can you hold for how long of a duration, and like have balance there? So you can do the same with life. How hard can you push with work, but still have time to spend with family and time to spend, just working on yourself, or be able to keep that for as long as possible. We talked about burnout. It's one of the biggest topics we've chatted about too. And it's, if you're an endurance athlete, but you approach it as an Olympic sprinter, like you're not gonna finish the distance that you're going for. So you have to figure out what that like perfect pace, a perfect push is, so that when you do put your head down on a pillow at the end of the night, you gave your all.
What's interesting is, I'm going to put it back specifically in the context of running, just for the purpose of this point. But you brought up, I'm going to mispronounce his name, Eliud Kipchoge, I believe, right? Broke the sub 2 hour marathon.
Yeah.
And I think when most people, myself included, imagine how that race went, they think, okay, whatever pace he needed to hold, which is just unhuman, say it was like 4 something, he's running flat 4-minute miles the entire time. And while it was down to a science, and he probably was pretty close to that, you think of most people running and what endurance looks like, it's a water break here and there. It's walking for a couple steps. It's retying your shoe. It's speeding up, slowing down, turning left, turning right. And I think people get tripped up when they think, oh, okay, I'm doing a good job. I'm being consistent. I'm enduring, but why are the results not coming the way I think they should come? Or why hasn't this happened yet? And then people get discouraged and they stop. So in your journey of endurance, just in life, have you had those moments where you wonder like, hey, like, I don't think this is working the way it should work. Like maybe I should just give up on this. And if so, have you stopped and why? And if so, have you kept going and why?
Yeah. And just to kind of, talk about that. And I know, you and I cover some distance when we go for runs too. So bringing it back to that, there's so many points in a run. Say we're going for a 10-mile run. There's so many points throughout that 10-mile run that you reassess a lot of the factors that are going on. You always look down at the watch and you're like, okay, is this a pace I want to hold, or are my legs feeling a little, sloppier than they should be, where I should slow it down a little bit and just regain, my control and everything. And it's the same with life, you have to, if there's a water stop and you feel like it's a perfect time for you to take a break, just reassess everything, think, and then start the wheels back up. You're going to do a much better job in that way than to say, no, water's for the weak, I'm just going to keep going. And then a mile later you hit a wall. So I think, we can, if we wanted to, we can zoom out and just bring all the conversations we've already had on this podcast into it, in terms of leaving your job, in terms of, just making tougher decisions. But I think it's, you just have to look at the steps to reassess as you go for endurance to make sure that you can hit that end prize, instead of always having this ego of just like, I can hold that pace. I don't need water. I don't need to reassess. I just get over the fact that I'm thinking about my legs, and get there. So.
I almost wonder, I don't think this phrase is completely accurate, but the phrase just popped into my head. Ego is the enemy of endurance.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of times ego does get in the way of what could potentially move somebody even further along their path. So real quick, to bring it back, have you had moments in your life that you can think of that you wanted to stop? You wanted to just say, all right, well, I think I'll just take the comfortable path and just stay at this job, or take the comfortable route and not go for this run?
Yeah, I've definitely had moments. I definitely had moments, and I definitely had those moments where I kind of sat in that position for a little bit. It's like, I would not mind in any of these marathons that I've done just getting in the fetal position and sitting down for a couple minutes. And I've had that moment in life, where you take a job and you're like, okay, maybe I've been doing way too much running around and I just need to settle and relax right now. And one of the biggest factors is, the parents and the grandparents that we talked about, when they're just like, hey, you're in a really good place right now. Things look calm right now. You look such, so much better, such less stress in your life. You look great. And it makes you rethink, like, okay, yeah, maybe I do need to dial it back and just stay here for a minute. But I think the way we operate, the way we think, especially, in today's day and age, we just recharge in those little stations and then we keep going. It's, I think the hardest part, or the most painful piece that we can do, is sit there for a while and then realize that it's been way too long in that comfortable position where we have to get out and go. And that's the same thing we talked about, of how do you not do something for 2 or 3 years and then you completely regret it. So
yeah, there's a Dale Carnegie quote where he says, inaction breeds doubt and fear. Action breeds confidence and courage. If you want to conquer fear, do not sit home and think about it. Go out and get busy.
That's amazing. And that's
right
on. Yeah.
And, but to counter that quote with a point you just made, sometimes there's nothing wrong with taking a seat and taking a rest and reassessing and slowing down. And I think sometimes we actually need to slow down before we can speed back up, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, you need to.
Yeah. So with that being said, I want to preface this last question with the fact that there are people listening to this podcast who hopefully throughout the course of our conversation have just, resonated with different parts, but maybe there's somebody listening who's going through a really tough time right now. And they're just not sure what to do or where to go. And they're looking for just some kind of guidance or encouragement. And we've touched on a lot of different topics. So if you were to talk directly to one person who's listening to this podcast right now, who's going through a tough season of life, what advice or guidance or encouragement would you have for that person listening right now?
Yeah, I think, if you're going through a tough patch, there's always light at the end of the tunnel. We talked about silver lining. I think really just taking that seat, really just figuring things out, and really simplifying everything that's going on. And I think simplifying is the wrong term to use there, because a lot of things are out of our control when we're in a dark place. But just really taking a breath to, figure out what you can do, what is in your control, and just really think about the future. Don't think about the now so much. I think, now is the painful part of it. Now is the tougher emotions that we deal with. And I'm going back to, our first question, really thinking about this. And, you are navigating through a lot of tough things right now, but what does this situation look like in 5 years? What kind of silver lining can you pull out? What have you learned from this, or what can you learn from this experience that'll make you a better person in 5 years? That'll strengthen who you are in 5 years. Because, sometimes and I always think back to, one of my favorite movies, Blow by Johnny Depp, and it's a Ray Liotta quote from that movie. And sometimes you're flush and sometimes you're a bust. And when you're up, it's never as good as it seems. And when you're down, you never think you'll be up again, but life goes on. And that's one of the things, like, we get so caught in the darker moments that, we have to just take a breath, look at the silver lining, figure out what we've learned from that situation. And as tough as it is to pull out of that, sometimes we need to know that the impact that that situation has had on us, we can have tenfold of an impact back on somebody else out there that we might not even know.
Yeah, it's interesting that we're having this conversation directly after I spoke on the last podcast episode with Chase Tuning, and we talked about just the importance of understanding that our actions and how we carry ourselves, especially through tougher seasons of life, have the potential to impact other people around us in such significant ways. And I almost want to add to that, what you said was beautiful, and just say that if you are going through a tough time right now, understand that this is an opportunity to show somebody else how to be strong, because it's not just about us.
Yeah, what we do day to day, I think we overlook how many people watch what we do day to day, especially if it's, if you have I always think about bigger families around. If you're in a home with, you have 3 brothers, 4 brothers, cousins, anybody that's living with you, just realize that, even though you might not realize it, even though you might feel like you are just one person who's not making an impact anywhere, you're a massive role model to every single person in that household, even though they might not voice it to you. And it's the same with work. There might be hundreds and hundreds of colleagues that look up to you as a mentor or role model, but they may not, voice it to you. They may just be very, introverted or just quiet folks. So just realize that every single thing you do every single day, you're shedding light, and you're really paving the path for the happiness and success of other people around you. So as long as you keep your head up and you keep pushing in that direction, there's a lot of people following you.
Yeah. To end on a lighthearted note, I was working with a client, an older client, the other day, and we're working on his posture. And so he walks with his head kind of hung down toward the ground. And I said, keep your chin up or the crown slips, princess. And he said, if I keep my head up, I won't find all the loose change on the floor. And 2 different ways to look at the same situation. So we met in the middle, and he kept his head up, but he kept his eyes kind of on the ground ahead of him so he can find the loose change. But with that being said, Sinan, thank you, man, for coming on the podcast and just sharing some light with the world. And if people want to follow along and they want to connect and see what you're up to, where's the best place for them to do that?
Absolutely. I think social media is probably where I spend most of my time with work. So if they want to follow me on Instagram, it's Dr_Synonymous. That's SYNONYMOUS. So Dr. Synonymous. And
so good. So good.
Yeah, I know. I stole it before anybody else got it. And then on Facebook, I don't post as frequently, but if they want to follow me on there, it's just Synonymous. So SINAN is the first name, and then Synonymous is spelled the same way.
Awesome. Well, Sinan, thank you so much for this conversation. I appreciate you greatly, and we'll have to do this again.
Absolutely, man. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Project Indoor podcast, go ahead and subscribe, leave a review on your platform of choice, and share this episode with a friend. It helps us get more conversations like this out to more people like you. We appreciate you, and we'll talk to you next time. And one more thing. If you're looking for a community of people all striving to be better together, check out the Project Indoor Hard Things Club. The link is in the description below. We'd love to have you.